He had spent years fighting words with words, forums, debates, online arguments. He was known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. Islam, to him, was just another religion, filled with rules, rituals, and stories that didn't make sense. He'd read some of the Qur'an, not to understand, but to find flaws. He watched debates, not to learn, but to prepare his counters. He believed truth was just logic, and whoever argued better, won. He wasn't searching for guidance, he was trying to prove that faith was fiction. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't always fight back with the same weapons. Sometimes it speaks softly, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it hides in the place you'd least expect. It was a regular day, a familiar scene. Another group of Muslims gathered in a community center. He walked in confidently, ready to challenge once more. The adults welcomed him, some with caution, others with kindness. They had seen this before. Another critic, another challenger, another person who thought Islam was just an idea to debate. But among the group was one young girl. She sat quietly, listening to everything. Her eyes didn't judge, and her heart didn't compete. She just watched him speak. Watched the frustration behind his confidence, the emptiness behind his logic. And then, as the discussion reached its usual intensity, she gently raised her hand. Everyone paused. Her voice was soft but sincere. "Can I ask something?" she said. He nodded, expecting a childish question. But what she said next froze the room. If everything ends, your job, your body, your loved ones, your life, then what are you living for? No arrogance, no accusation, just a simple question. But it landed like a thunderclap. He blinked. For the first time, he had nothing to say. He had argued with scholars, theologians, and sheiks, but this wasn't an argument. It was truth spoken from a pure heart. A heart not trying to win, but trying to understand. And in that moment, something cracked inside him. The question haunted him long after he left. It followed him into the night, into his thoughts, into the silence where there was no one to argue with. What am I living for? He had spent so long trying to disprove others that he had never stopped to ask what he believed in. He could explain science, he could challenge theology, but he couldn't answer a child's question. Days passed, then weeks. Curiosity turned into reflection. He picked up the Qur'an again, but this time not to fight, this time to listen. And the words that once seemed distant now felt alive. Verses about purpose, about the soul, about standing before the one who created him. It was as if the question had unlocked something in him, a door that had been sealed by pride, finally opened by innocence. And slowly, he changed. He stopped debating. He started asking real questions, not about others, but about himself. His heart began to soften. He cried, something he hadn't done in years. Not from sadness, but from awakening. That young girl, without knowing, had done what no scholar could. She hadn't argued, she had reminded. Because sometimes truth doesn't come in shouting matches or intellectual victories. Sometimes it comes in the quiet question of someone whose heart is still close to its fitrah. He came to mock Islam, but he left searching for its light. And in that journey, one question became the reason his soul finally found peace. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove Islam wrong. In online debates, university discussions, and late-night conversations, he built his identity on challenging Muslims. To him, Islam was a religion filled with rigid rules, outdated ideas, and blind followers. He prided himself on asking tough questions, poking holes in arguments, and walking away feeling victorious. Every debate became another chance to reinforce what he already believed, that religion was man-made, and faith was nothing more than emotional dependence. He wasn't looking for truth, he was looking for flaws. And for years, he thought he had found enough of them to be satisfied. But deep inside, something was always unsettled. Every time he shut down a conversation, there was a silence that echoed louder than the words. He never admitted it, not even to himself, but the way some Muslims responded with patience, with sincerity, with calmness, confused him. Why didn't they get angry? Why didn't they panic when he questioned their beliefs? It was as if they had a peace he didn't understand. Still, he brushed it off. Peace, he thought, was just another illusion. Then came the moment that changed everything. He joined yet another discussion, just another group, just another day, just another attempt to prove Islam wrong. He expected the usual, some resistance, some back and forth, and then a tired end. But this time, something was different. Among the group was a young Muslim girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. She had been quietly listening, not interrupting, not arguing, and when the moment came, she didn't debate him, she didn't quote a verse. She just asked one simple question: if everything ends, then what are you living for? He laughed at first, then he paused, then he couldn't answer. Well, that one question unraveled everything he thought he knew. It wasn't the kind of question you fight, it was the kind that stays with you in the quiet. He couldn't shake it off. It followed him home. It sat with him in silence. It poked at a part of him that logic had never touched. And in that moment he realized he had been arguing for years, but he had never truly reflected. This time, he didn't want to debate anymore. He wanted to understand. The days following that moment were not normal. Something inside him had shifted. That young girl's question, so gentle, so unexpected, kept echoing in his mind like a voice he couldn't silence. If everything ends, then what are you living for? It was simple, yet it exposed the very emptiness he had been running from. He had always believed he lived for reason, for logic, for knowledge. But now, stripped of his arguments and pride, he realized he didn't really have an answer. What did he live for, really? Comfort, career, pleasure, approval? None of it lasted, none of it truly satisfied. He had mocked faith for being emotional, but what was he clinging to now? Nothing but a fading sense of control. For the first time in years, he found himself sitting quietly with the Qur'an, not as a critic, but as a listener. He opened it not to argue, but to understand. And what he found was unlike anything he had expected. The verses weren't just poetic, they were deeply personal. It was as if they spoke directly to him, calling out the doubts he had buried under layers of pride. He read about those who turned away from truth, even after knowing it. He read about hearts that are sealed after arrogance takes root. But he also read about mercy, about second chances, about guidance waiting for those who truly seek it. Tears came, slowly at first, then suddenly, not because of guilt alone, but because of how wrong he had been. He realized he had been fighting the very truth that his heart had always longed for. Islam was not what he had imagined. It wasn't a system of control. It was a path to liberation. It didn't demand blind obedience. It invited understanding. It didn't shut down thinking. It awakened it. That young girl's question was more than just words. It was a key that unlocked the heart of someone who had been too proud to admit he was lost. And now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to find peace. And in the silence of reflection, he discovered that the truth he had resisted for so long was the very truth his soul had always been searching for. He had always believed that strength came from knowing how to win arguments, how to speak with confidence, how to break someone else's belief with the weight of logic. For years, he took pride in his ability to challenge Muslims and shake their faith with questions that sounded intellectual but were often rooted in pride. He wasn't just questioning Islam. He was defending his own identity, an identity built on independence, self-reliance, and a rejection of anything that required submission. To him, Islam demanded surrender, and that went against everything he thought made him strong. But the longer he stayed in silence after that one question, the question from a young girl who didn't argue, didn't insult, didn't even raise her voice, the more he began to realize something painful. His strength had been a mask, a way to cover the fear he never acknowledged. Fear that maybe he was wrong. Fear that maybe his heart had hardened to the truth a long time ago. Fear that if he let go of the arguments, he'd have to face himself. He had worn confidence like armor, but now that armor was cracked, and through those cracks, something new began to grow. humility. The more he read the Qur'an, the more he saw that the true strength Islam talks about isn't found in debate. It's found in surrender to the truth. The Prophet Muhammad wasn't just a speaker. He was a man of mercy, patience, and deep emotional strength. He won hearts not through force, but through sincerity. And the companions didn't become leaders of the world because they won arguments. They became great because they submitted their egos to something greater than themselves. That realization struck deep. He began to pray, not perfectly, not without struggle, but sincerely. Each sajda felt like a weight lifting off his chest. In prostration, he found what argument could never give him: peace, real peace. Not the kind that comes from being right, but the kind that comes from being real. It was never about proving Islam wrong. It was about healing the wound he never admitted he had. And the one who helped him begin that healing wasn't a scholar or a debater. It was a child whose question was stronger than any argument he had ever made. He began to notice something he had never paid attention to before. Every time he listened to a Muslim speak from the heart, there was a calmness in their words. Not rehearsed, not defensive, just genuine. And now that his ego had quieted, he could finally hear it. That calmness wasn't weakness, it was faith. The kind of faith that didn't depend on being praised, or proving a point, or being right in the eyes of others. It was faith built on a relationship with something higher, a connection to Allah. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the urge to challenge it. He wanted to understand it. The world he had lived in was full of noise, constant stimulation, endless opinions, the chase for success, the obsession with being in control. But now, as he sat alone with his thoughts, he realized how hollow it had all been. That one innocent question had peeled away layers of distractions and exposed the truth. He had been afraid of stillness because stillness forced him to think. And thinking, deeply and honestly, would eventually lead him to questions that no worldly answer could satisfy. Where did I come from? Why am I here? What happens after I die? The Quran didn't just answer these questions, it asked them too. It didn't demand belief before reflection. It encouraged reflection as a path to belief. As he read more, he encountered verses that spoke directly to the human soul. Verses about the signs in the creation. Verses about the heart. Verses that called mankind to remember, to reflect, to return. And he couldn't help but feel that these words weren't just revealed for the people of the past. They were speaking to him right now. That one girl's question wasn't just an interruption in a debate, it was a door. A door to silence. A door to thought. A door to sincerity. And walking through it, he realized something beautiful. Islam was never afraid of questions. It welcomed them. It just wanted those questions to come from the heart, not the ego. And now, his heart was finally asking, not to win, not to challenge, but to find what it had been missing all along: meaning, purpose, and peace. In the past, he thought of Muslims as people who followed rules blindly, who bowed out of fear, and who silenced their doubts in the name of faith. That's what he told himself whenever he felt the quiet tug of something deeper. But now, with the walls of pride crumbling, he began to see something entirely different. He saw Muslims who weren't afraid to feel. People who cried in prayer not because they were weak, but because they were connected. People who smiled in hardship not because they were naive, but because they trusted. He had spent years trying to understand Islam with his mind, but now he was beginning to see it with his heart. What struck him the most was not the intellectual arguments or the eloquence of preachers. It was the stillness of those who truly believed. That young girl's question didn't give him information. It gave him a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw a version of himself he had long buried. A child who used to wonder, who used to ask the big questions about life and death, about the stars, about the soul. Somewhere along the way, he had traded that childlike curiosity for cynicism, traded wonder for sarcasm, and traded truth for control. But now, in the simplicity of a single question, that forgotten self, had returned. He began watching Muslims not to critique them but to learn. He watched how they paused for prayer, how they whispered du'as under their breath, how they showed patience in silence. He saw a way of life, not just a religion. Islam was not a set of chains. It was a key. And each act of worship, each word of the Qur'an, each prostration was not submission to man, but a return to the Creator. That realization changed everything. The pride he once held in his ability to defeat others in debate now seemed meaningless. Because what is the point of winning arguments if the soul remains empty? What is the point of being loud if the heart stays hollow? He didn't convert overnight, but he softened. And sometimes, that's the greatest miracle. Because when the heart softens, the soul begins to breathe. And when it breathes, it starts looking not for victory, but for truth. And in that search, he finally began to find peace. One evening, after weeks of quiet reflection, he found himself standing outside a masjid. Not to argue, not to observe, but to feel. He didn't walk in right away. He just stood there, watching people walk in calmly, leaving the chaos of the world behind as they entered a space of peace. There was no performance, no pressure, no noise, just people, young and old, answering a call that he had ignored all his life, the call to prayer. And for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like someone on the edge of something beautiful. He walked in, slowly, sat at the back, listened, watched. A man was reciting the Qur'an, and even though he didn't understand every word, the tone touched something deep in him. It wasn't the meaning alone, it was the feeling, the rhythm, the sincerity, the sound of someone speaking to their Lord with no one watching but Allah. He looked around and saw others silently crying, eyes closed, hands raised. There was a purity here he had never known, a connection that no argument or philosophy had ever given him. And in that moment, something inside him gave in, not to pressure, not to fear, but to peace. The peace of knowing he didn't have to fight anymore. He didn't have to wear the mask. He didn't have to run from the questions. He had found the answer, not in a book, not in a lecture, but in the heart of a child who simply wanted to know what he lived for. And now, he had an answer. He didn't walk out of the masjid with a certificate or an announcement, but something had changed. He had crossed a line. From resistance to reflection, from doubt to direction. His journey wasn't over, but it had begun. And he knew that the truth of Islam wasn't something that had been forced upon him, it had been shown to him. Through kindness, through sincerity, and through a question that carried more power than 1,000 debates. Sometimes it only takes one voice to break through years of noise. And sometimes the most powerful voice doesn't come from a stage or a scholar, but from a heart that speaks sincerely. That night, he didn't just walk into a masjid. He walked into the beginning of his return to Allah. In the end, it wasn't a powerful scholar, a complex debate, or a philosophical argument that changed him. It was one question, spoken softly by a young Muslim girl. A question that didn't try to win, didn't try to impress, but went straight to the heart. If everything ends, then what are you living for? That one moment exposed years of pride, shattered layers of doubt, and opened the door to something far greater than he had ever imagined. Because sometimes it's not knowledge that we lack, it's sincerity. Not evidence that we need, but humility. He had spent years speaking, challenging, debating, but when he finally listened, truly listened, he discovered what his soul had been yearning for all along: peace, purpose, and the truth of Islam. This story is not just about one man. It's about all of us. How often do we chase arguments but avoid reflection? How many people do we speak to but never truly hear? And how many hearts are just waiting for one kind word, one sincere question, one moment of honesty to finally awaken. So never underestimate the power of truth delivered with gentleness. And never think your voice is too small to make a difference. That girl's voice changed a man's life. Maybe your voice will be the next. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share. Let this be more than just a video. Let it be a reminder that guidance is always near, that hearts can change, and that sometimes all it takes is one honest question. See you in the next video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.